Constitution of the United States. So there's absolutely no way that you can find an implied authority in this entity when it was proposed to give it that power and those three words were removed. So 1788, 1791, Bill of Rights, that period of time, what do we have? We have a system that's running, in principle, entirely on a gold and silver coin basis, as official money. I say as official money because nothing in the Constitution would preclude private parties from engaging in banking. And typically what banks did then, and they do now, at least through the Federal Reserve cartel, but individual banks did then, was to emit their own bills of credit, private bills of credit, bank notes, which typically they promised to redeem in gold or silver, usually on demand, so that they'd push the circulation. But there's nothing in the Constitution that would prevent that kind of activity, except insofar as it was fraudulent, and then the Commerce Clause, for instance, would come into play, or the state police powers could come into play. All right. So you had a private sector monetary system that would depend upon honest bankers. And then you had an official system that was based entirely on gold and silver. Why? Because that's the one system that prevents the government from redistributing wealth. Unless the government happens to have gold and silver mines, where does the coinage come from? It comes from the free market through some minter. And the system of minting that you find in the Mint Act of 1792 is what was called free coinage. The mint was open to all the gold and silver that might be brought from the marketplace. And it would cost the individual who brought that gold and silver nothing to have it converted into coinage. They were essentially treating coinage as a public utility. Or if the individual wanted to take his coinage immediately, then he had to pay a premium for that. But basically the government's role was to mint gold and silver, and by putting a stamp on those coins defined in the statute, to certify what the weight of gold and silver was in the official coins that were coming out of the mint. Period. End of discussion. Now we go back to what I was discussing a little bit earlier, the gold-silver ratio. Of course, the gold-silver ratio changed fairly quickly after the 1792 Mint Act. Moved up, went from the 15 to 16 level. So comes the statute of 1834, Coinage Act of 1834. Congress now recognizes this problem. And they engaged in regulation of the older coinage, changed its gold, the value of the older gold coinage, and they came up with a new gold coinage that would reflect this new 16-to-1 ratio. Now, what was interesting that at that time, there was a Senate committee, coinage committee, that recommended what I think everybody today would recognize as the right thing to do. They said, look, let the gold coins float. That's our term, not theirs. Don't give them a dollar denomination. We're calling them eagles anyway. Simply put a weight denomination on them and let the marketplace determine from day to day what these gold coins are valued in terms of the silver dollar. But apparently traditionalism overcame innovation, as it were. And so they stuck with the bimetallic ratio. And apparently there was also lurking in the background the idea that if they used that fixed ratio, they'd be able to put pressure on the Bank of the United States. So there was a political brouhaha in the background. So there was a point at which a great deal of future difficulties could have been avoided, but weren't. The next example of that is 1849. A gold dollar was coined. Very small coin, looked like a button. And in principle, I suppose one could say, well, if what you're talking about there is a gold dollar that has a gold coin that has the value of $1, that's all right. But in fact, it began to have people think of a gold dollar as opposed to a silver dollar. Well, silver dollar is a redundancy, right? A gold dollar. So now this is the beginning of the gold-silver political controversy, which eventually breaks out in a large scale after the Civil War, 1873. All right, now let's go back to paper money. No paper money being generated out of the Treasury, no paper money being generated out of the states, paper money being generated out of banks. But there was this, let me call it an incestuous relationship between Congress and the banking system. Alexander Hamilton said it very well. He said, well, we need to have the merchants on the side of the government. And to have the merchants on the side of the government, we have to give them a certain amount of special interest legislation. He didn't put it quite that way, but that's what he meant. And the Bank of the United States was one of those pieces of special interest legislation. It was a private entity. The government of the United States had some influence over the selection of the directors. And it was generating its own banknotes. So you had the first Bank of the United States, that wasn't renewed. You had the second Bank of the United States, famous bank fight with Jackson, and the charter was not renewed. And by the time you get to the Civil War, you don't even have a connection between the government of the United States and private banking. You had these two episodes, and they're gone. At the state level, there were a lot of state banks, private state banks chartered by the state governments. So the system is pretty much the same as it was at the beginning. Now comes the Civil War. Union government had a problem. It was an unpopular war. There were a lot of Southern sympathizers, even to the extent of being the so-called Copperheads, really sympathizers of the South. There's great difficulty in raising taxation to the level necessary to pay for this war. The banks were charging astronomical rates of interest. So now the Union Congress found itself in a fiscal squeeze. So what did they do? Well, Salmon P. Chase, Secretary of the Treasury, comes forward and says, aha, we're going to do the same thing that I told you they did in the colonial period, right? Whenever they had a war, what was the first thing they did after they raised the troops? They printed paper money. So 1862, February of 1862, the first paper money under the government of the United States, under the Constitution, purportedly under the Constitution, is emitted, the so-called greenbacks, because on one side they were printed with green ink. And these were made legal tender and lawful money, legal tender for payment of all debts and lawful money. And supposedly they were going to be redeemed, but they weren't redeemed during the war because the government was not redeeming anything. They were just what's called suspension of specie payments during the war. So now we have gold and silver coinage and these irredeemable legal tender paper notes. Comes the end of the war. You had two political parties, if you will. You had a greenback party, a greenback movement that wanted to expand the paper money. They thought this was a great idea. And then you had the sound money movement that wanted to redeem and then remove the paper money entirely. So they compromised. And the compromise was that the paper money would be redeemed as it came into the Treasury for gold and silver coin, but then the Treasury could re-emit that paper money. And here's where the Supreme Court comes into play, because there were two interesting cases dealing with the constitutionality of paper money. First is the Knox case, 1871, and there's a Juilliard case in 1884, I guess. And the question in the Knox case was, is this stuff constitutional? And it was a 5-4 decision. Interestingly enough, Salmon P. Chase had become the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in the interim. And he was in the minority. He said, oh no, I was wrong. This is unconstitutional. I should never have done this. But it didn't matter. There were a bunch of railroad lawyers on the court by then, Republicans. And not to knock the Republicans, but it was a political point of view in this. And they said, look, this was necessary to win the war. This was an emergency legislation. It was necessary to win the war. And besides, we can't go back now and declare it unconstitutional and unwind all of these contracts that have been made in it. Now that was false, because in fact there were a whole series of cases in which they unwound contracts that had been made in Confederate money and had come up through the court system to determine whether those contracts could be enforced. But that was the basis. This was an emergency piece of legislation. Well, now comes the re-emission of the Treasury notes. And somebody noticed, wait a minute, we're not in an emergency anymore. There's no war going on here. There was another challenge, Juilliard versus Greenman case, and the Supreme Court said, well, yeah, we said that about an emergency then, but actually it's for Congress to decide when it should do this. And see, this is the incremental way the Constitution has been subverted, really. And I lay it all at the doorstep of the Supreme Court. They don't operate properly in dealing with this, with the Constitution. They treat the Constitution as some kind of common law document, which it isn't. But in any event, there we had it. So now we have paper money as a permanent fixture in the system, but it's paper money that is redeemable in gold or silver. Even the earlier decision had pointed that out. And it's paper money that issues from where? From the United States Treasury. All right? Not from a private institution of some kind. Now, meanwhile, the banks are coming into closer involvement with the government. Civil War, you have the National Currency Act, the creation of the national banking system. We still have those banks today, the national banks, Chase Manhattan Bank, National Bank, Wachovia, National Bank, right? Is it still around, Wachovia? Well, whatever. Okay. National banks. Comes from the Civil War, 1863 and 1864. 2 statutes were passed. That system was a kind of a cartel because you had the rural banks and you had the small city banks and the big city banks, and the rural banks were supposed to deposit their money in the larger banks, and the larger banks would deposit in the big city banks, which were New York and Chicago. So it was a way to essentially focus financial resources behind the big players, essentially in Wall Street and Chicago. But it was limited because the currency depended upon the banks buying U.S. bonds and depositing the bonds with the Treasury, and then they could emit currency 90% of the value of their bonds. And this was a period in time when the United States government and the people were not particularly interested in extending public indebtedness. They had huge public indebtedness from the Civil War. So there was a restriction on the banks. Well, banks don't like restrictions on the emission of currency, because how do they make their money? They emit currency at interest, right? So the more they can emit, the more in return they make. They didn't like that. Well, fractional reserve banking, you probably heard, if you heard Joe Salerno, he'll tell you fractional reserve banking is an inherently unstable process, and so we had a series of bank crises from the Civil War through the turn of the 20th century, and eventually the big one, 1907. And during this period of time, the bankers came up with the idea, well, we need a central bank. This cartel structure we have is too loose. We need to bring it together with a lender of last resort, a capstone. And this is the basis of the Federal Reserve System. Now, the Federal Reserve System is interesting because Federal Reserve notes are not simply notes of a private banking system, or bank cartel, or private individual banks. Although all the Federal Reserve regional banks and all the commercial banks are all private institutions, thank you very much. Federal Reserve notes were made obligations of the United States. So now you have the American people on the hook for this banking system. Now, they were also originally to be redeemed in lawful money or gold.